So what I like to do with readings is to read a section, and then I invite people to use the first part of the reading, kind of like a Quaker meeting or something, where we just have quiet, but you flip through and find something that touches you or moves you or inspires you, and just read. It could be a few sentences, it could be a paragraph, it could be a page or two, and then when you're done, we'll just have quiet till someone else finds one. So it's just kind of a little bit Dylan Thomas-y, you know. And then we'll take a little break, and I'll read another section, and then we'll kind of spend the second half doing a little bit more discussion. But I found it's a fun way for me to hear the book, and it's keeps people more engaged than just sitting and being passive. So, and gives you a chance to look at the pictures. Okay. So I think I'll start here at the beginning of this chapter called Climate, Water, and Health. And some of you, this will be a familiar, and no need to read along. I just, unless you like to. I generally don't pay much attention to the daily weather predictions, preferring to be surprised. But on a Saturday night in August 2011, when I saw my neighbors at the gas station filling up one container after another for their generators, I knew something was up. Hurricanes, said the weather report, are great big heat engines, taking warm, moist air and hoisting it aloft tens of thousands of feet into the air. That hot, wet air hits the cold upper atmosphere and makes these clouds. It's basically like smoke from a big chimney, except it's water vapor, not smoke. On the bright side, these types of clouds could treat us to a nice sunset this evening, a small treat that doesn't come close to offsetting what will hit us when Irene roars through. When I heard the word hurricane, I felt myself tremble. 6 years before, I had been right smack in the middle of Hurricane Wilma's path during a medical conference in Florida, and the memory hadn't fully left my body. As I tried to translate Florida to Vermont, I was mostly worried about wind, the kind of wind I had to lean and push my body through, heart-pounding, holding hands with colleagues I barely knew as we climbed down the outdoor staircase from our fourth-floor hotel rooms. The kind of wind that had blown out the upper hotel walls, sent trees flying through the air, and flattened stop signs to the ground, leaving 70 of us stranded for several days in a powerless hotel where we had nothing to eat except canned salad bar items and wedding cakes that were rapidly defrosting in the hotel freezers. It started to rain. There were so many trees in Vermont that it seemed hopeless to even start preparing for that kind of wind. I moved anything out of the yard that might fly around and smash a window, and moved my car out from under the tree where it was parked. I filled up some water buckets in case of a power outage, emptied out a small bucket that had started to catch rain from a leak in my roof, and waited. I got an email from the fire chief asking if I could help out at the Red Cross emergency shelter. I was surprised. I was one of 15 people in our town who had done a preliminary training several months before, when the elementary school was equipped as a shelter for potential future emergencies. We didn't really expect to ever have to use it, but the chief said that up to 30 families were expected at the shelter that night, and that police and firefighters had been evacuating our neighbors all along the Ampampinisic River. Closing my laptop, I noticed that the bucket had filled up with rainwater again, even though it seemed like I had just emptied it. Later that evening, with Hurricane Irene dumping millions of gallons of rain on our town, I decided I had to see what was going on with my river. A few hours before, I'd been appointed shelter manager, and I was sitting around with a few other volunteers. Things were fairly quiet. I handed Mike, the owner of the village store, the walkie-talkie and told him I'd be right back. It was like checking on a beloved friend. I gathered up my sons from the cafeteria saying, let's go look at the river. And they jumped up and grabbed their coats. Henry and Alden are well aware of the river's many seasonal, weekly, and daily moods and how they form the liturgical cycle of our year. It's one of the strongest relationships in our lives. The boys and I ran through the rain to the car and headed down to the Tucker Hill covered bridge that spans the waterfall that used to power one of many local mills. This was the exciting place to walk out onto the rocks during spring flooding and listen to the roar, to jump in quick and naked while the water was barely moving on a hot summer day, or to sit and watch the water slide over frozen tuffets of ice-covered rocks in the winter. But we didn't get to the bridge. When we saw that Sharon, the dog catcher's yard, was flooded, we stopped and got out. In 20 years, I had never seen this happen. How could the water be that high? We started to take a detour on foot and walked partway down a little path toward the river, but I reached out and stopped Henry and Alden when I saw the river itself. The waves were about 8 feet tall as they crested over the rocks. One part was shooting high, high up into the air like a huge rooster comb, while the rest of it went barreling down at a tremendous speed. The bottom of the bridge was not far at all above the torrent of this swollen river. This bridge had seen some damage over the past decade, with occasional oversized dump trucks ramming through the roof by accident, and a car full of my friends crashing through the wooden wall, only to be saved by a doctor who happened to be driving behind them. But as I watched the scene before me, I saw that we could lose the covered bridge entirely today if the water got any higher. Or if the Manning's log yard, a quarter-mile up the road, which was already starting to fill with water, let loose its stockpiles of hundreds of piled-up trees waiting to be transported, and all that came barreling downstream all at once. I shuddered, and we headed back up to the shelter. I showed Mike and Tig, the other shelter volunteers, the video I'd shot on my cell phone, and they just shook their heads. They were getting minute-by-minute reports from around the region on the walkie-talkie, which was connected to the emergency and fire departments. Bartonsville lost their covered bridge a few minutes ago, said Mike, and so did Quechee. In one night of flooding, 200 bridges and 500 miles of roads were washed away just in my small state of Vermont. As we pored over our friends' pictures on Facebook and drove through the landscape over the next week, we saw things we'd never imagined. Cows and chickens and sheep drowned in our neighbors' fields, well-known stores and restaurants filled with mud and water, propane tanks washed downriver from a supplier and piled up against a dam downtown. Houses tilted at crazy angles, roads collapsed everywhere we went. Community gardens that we had eaten fresh greens out of just the week before, covered with sewage that had overflowed from the treatment plant. Our own Ampampanoosic River had collected a seemingly endless supply of soccer balls, basketballs, and volleyballs, along with trees, plastic bottles, rhododendron bushes, and lawn chairs. But they didn't move. They just sat there on the water, staring at us. The dam was closed to protect towns downstream, and we ended up with a large lake filled with debris rather than a swift-moving river. A porta potty floated on its side, with a bluish cloud of human waste floating on the stagnant water around it. This was a familiar landscape turned unfamiliar. I used to think climate change was boring, but after Hurricane Irene ripped through our town, and after I understood that climate change was about water, it became interesting to me. Now I wanted to know about carbon, and the more I learned, the more interested I became. For a couple of hundred years, human civilization has persistently dug, drilled, and pumped ancient carbon out of the earth. Carbon that stores the energy that used to be sunshine, which then became plants, and animals that ate the plants, and slowly compacted into a layer of thick black stuff and explosive gases. Petroleum, coal, and natural gas are all called fossil fuels because they come from this carbon-rich fossil layer of the earth and sea. Years ago, folks said you could poke a stick in the ground in Texas and oil would come shooting out of the earth. That kind of easy oil is all used up. We made 1 million plastic doodads out of it. Toys for our kids, toys for ourselves, toys for our dogs, and toys for our gerbils. At home, we had Tupperware parties and danced in our polyester clothes made out of petroleum, while listening to music pressed into records and cassettes and 8-track tapes made out of it. At work, we made pharmaceutical drugs out of the easy carbon chains in it, and soothing salves and ointments with petroleum jelly. We made disposable plastic syringes, pill bottles, disposable tubes, disposable IV bags. In hospitals and at home, we replaced metal and glass and rubber with it in every way we could think of, so that we could use things once and throw them away and get rid of the germs and not think about them anymore. We burned it to heat our homes and our hospitals and factories. We boiled it down to a thick paste and made highways across the globe out of tar, and homes with linoleum floors and vinyl siding and asphalt roofs. And then we burned it some more to drive our cars so we could live far away from work and vacation even farther away. We burned it to power ships and trains and planes and trucks. We shipped 1 million plastic doodads around the world, bringing things here from China and sending stuff back to China. We used up lots of it to build rockets and spaceships and blasted them out into unknown places to see if there were any other planets like ours with water we could drink and cows walking around that we could eat. There weren't. So we tweaked it in laboratories and created chemicals and weapons in case somebody tried to take our oil. And in between wars, we tweaked those chemicals and made pesticides and herbicides so we could hop on a huge piece of farm machinery and drive around and not have to pull weeds or pick bugs off of our potato plants or talk to our mule when she wouldn't listen. We tweaked it some more and made truckloads full of televisions, telephones, fax machines, and laptops with little plastic keys like the ones I'm typing on right now. It was great. It was cheap. It was easy. It was fun. So I will pick up that story in a bit, but I'll let you guys flip around for a minute and see if you find something that you'd like to read.
Can I just ask what town you were in?
In Thetford.
That's out of
Yes.
Thetford.
Just jump in.
I'm at the beginning of chapter 9. Different societies have different ways of recognizing the basic reality that actually everything belongs to everyone. In hunting and herding cultures, like those of the Inuit or Mongolians, land, grass, trees, ice, and water are, or were, all part of the commons, shared among the humans and animals who roam through the area. Certain groups may control certain territories, but within those groups, resources are generally shared. When the linguist Daniel Everett visited the Paraha, a Brazilian hunting culture, he was surprised to see that after a large kill, the hunters would share the animal with everyone in the village without storing any for later. "Why don't you store the meat?" Everett asked. "I store meat in the belly of my brother," the hunter answered.
Okay. I found this interesting, but everything's interesting in this book. In 1989, scientists proposed that the rate of chronic illness, in particular allergic and autoimmune disorders, was rising in wealthier, developed nations because of a lack of exposure to dirt and bacteria, specifically in the early years when the immune system is developing. This theory was nicknamed the hygiene hypothesis. It started out with one famous study published in The Lancet, which showed that babies growing up on farms who were exposed to stables and to raw milk had a lower incidence of asthma and allergies. And another study that showed that children who had taken antibiotics in infancy were more likely to develop asthma. Wild rats, whether living in the countryside or in city sewers, were also found to have healthier immune systems than laboratory rats raised without exposure to germs and dirt. The explanation given was that the dirty rats' rough and rugged immune systems were better poised to fight actual pathogens rather than reacting over mild irritants the way sheltered immune systems do when they have no actual work to do. In our highly sterilized world, autoimmune and allergic disorders are on the rise. 1 in every 12 people in the US now has asthma, and 1 in 6 African American children. The National Institutes of Health says the prevalence of autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, and inflammatory bowel disorders is rising dramatically as well. It now appears that the lack of certain gut bacteria is implicated. Babies born by cesarean section miss out on the initial colonizing bacteria from the mother's birth canal and perineum and have 20% higher incidence of childhood asthma and a decrease in overall immunity. This puts a sting in the fact that the current rate of C-sections in the U.S. is climbing fast. About 1/3 of all births in the U.S. are now C-sections and half of all births in China. The World Health Organization estimates that only about 15% of these C-sections are necessary. 1/4 of babies born in the United States are never breastfed, and half are breastfed for less than 6 months, which represents a gigantic blow to a baby's immune system at birth. There is no passive immunity from the mother without breast milk and the hundreds of varieties of good bacteria it provides. Graham Ruick, a professor at the Center for Infectious Diseases and International Health in London, renamed the hygiene hypothesis the old friends hypothesis. The problem, according to Ruick, is not so much about being too clean. It's that in our newly sterilized lives, we are missing out on many important members of our inner ecosystem with which we co-evolved, and that we actually rely on to teach our system how to respond without overreacting to the environment, to food, to events, and to its own tissues. And you go on.
About profiting from illness. Artist Steve Lambert is traveling around the U.S. with a sign saying, "Capitalism works for me," and asking citizens to vote true or false. What interests Steve is not just the vote coming out of this, but also the conversations he is having with people as they think about how to vote. One conversation with a physician caught Steve's attention. "Capitalism is working for me," said the doctor, "but it's not working for my patients." The doctor went on to say that most of the illness he sees is caused by capitalism. What does he mean? What is the relationship between capitalism, health, and healthcare? And maybe more importantly, what is the relationship between the growth economy, the need to make greater and greater profits because of the foundation of debt that our economy is based on, and our desire to look out for each other's well-being? The doctor that Steve interviewed, a specialist in endoscopic surgeries, explains that innovation in the medical profession is driven by investment, which allows people to invent new products and new technology. On the one hand, he sees that innovation is a good thing because we have more tools with which to diagnose and treat illness. But on the other hand, when you put it all together, there is something very dark about the whole setup. Innovation is only needed, he says, because we let people get unhealthy, and that is the unsettling reason for why we are at the forefront of technological advancements. He says capitalism works for him as a doctor for one reason only. Because if the system was supporting everyone to do what they are supposed to be doing, taking good care of themselves, eating well, spending time with their families, and having a meditative practice, he'd be out of a job. Can I make a comment?
We'll
Okay.
comment after.
I'll try not to.
As more and more technology is available to separate us from anything that is uncomfortable, unwanted, inconvenient, or that we simply don't know how to deal with, we become less and less resilient. Resiliency is the ability to rebound after challenges and to respond and adapt to changing circumstances. It is the hallmark of all species that share the resources of the earth. None of us would be here if we weren't resilient. Diversity and complexity help to make systems resilient, flexible, and adaptable. Yet those are preciously the qualities that our modern systems of medicine and agriculture have left behind. Our over-reliance on technology to control the complexity around us teaches us just the opposite, that we don't have to shift or adapt or compromise. Instead, we can take a drug, change a generic code, or surgically remove whatever is in our way. Whether it's a lump of fat tissue on our belly, an insect eating our corn, or a group of people who live on land we want for mining purposes.
I'm gonna jump back in with a continue. I'm skipping ahead a little bit with the story that I started. I'm talking to my friend Bob about climate change. Bob is a software engineer and web designer who used to be the repairman for the private jet of his Indian guru. He now spends his weekends building trebuchets, reading history books, and fixing things like my vacuum cleaner. When I get overwhelmed, he invites me over to his house, which is filled with computers, sits me down in front of his wood stove, and cooks me delicious things in his microwave. I point out that over the past century, we've pulled a lot of carbon out of the ground and sent it into the atmosphere in the form of CO2. Now we're trying to solve the climate crisis by figuring out who is to blame. Should we focus on auto emissions, on power plants, or on feedlots? Should we pressure our politicians or our neighbors? The more the climate crisis heats up, the more fragmented and bizarre the blame becomes. Recently, the Woods Hole Research Center released a dead serious article saying that Arctic ground squirrels were partially to blame for melting the permafrost layer and worsening global warming. The problem, reported newspapers, is that they dig under the permafrost and then their urine and feces nourish the microbes that create methane. That same week, other researchers blamed beavers, hypothesizing that their shallow, stagnant beaver ponds allow biological material to build up, which similarly releases methane via the activity of microbes. Bob points out that even I can play this game by blaming hospitals, capitalists, and technology. I have to admit that he is right. We definitely need to stop blaming and start reducing our fossil fuel emissions. But there's another issue here. Even if we stopped all emissions today, unless we can find a way to actually remove the excess CO2 from the atmosphere, current modeling predicts that temperatures will continue to rise and will not drop significantly for centuries or even millennia because there's a delay in the effect. It's as if we're filling up a huge bathtub in the sky faster than the drain can work. So, it's not just about getting people or squirrels to stop their behavior. In order to actually reverse global warming, we'll have to figure out how to get the excess carbon out of the sky and put it back in the ground. Since the carbon cycle involves all of life, this is a challenge unlike any other. So instead of spending our time trying to figure out who's to blame for putting it up there in the first place, we might want to focus on figuring out who is most willing and most capable to do the work of bringing it back down. Bob puts down a plate of steaming burritos and pulls an oversized container of BJ's guacamole out of the refrigerator. I think someone could invent a machine, Bob says, that takes CO2 out of the air and breaks it back down into carbon and oxygen and creates something really useful. That wouldn't work, I say. You'd need to use some sort of fossil fuel to keep the machine going. No, you wouldn't, he says. It would be solar powered. As it turns out, Bob was right. Shortly after our conversation, I learned that someone did invent a way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, break it back down into carbon stored safely, and in the process create oxygen so fresh we can breathe it. The process is powered entirely by sunlight, so it is cheap and it's not even noisy. Amazing! But Bob was also wrong, because it wasn't a person who invented the process. Land plants and water-dwelling phytoplankton do this all day long, quietly, freely, without complaint, as if it was their God-given purpose. The process is called photosynthesis, and it has been happening on our planet for more than 2 billion years. The carbon cycle on land, a beautiful dance between deep-rooted plants, soil microorganisms, fungi, minerals, sunlight, moisture, and insect and animal life, actually moves carbon out of the atmosphere and very efficiently puts it to work, building life on Earth. Photosynthesis is only the first step. Carbon moves first through plant carbohydrates into everything that eats the plants and their sugary exudates, and then moves on out in multiple directions through the food chain. Even though we're not plants, we wouldn't be here without photosynthesis. We often think of carbon simply as something inert and chemical, but carbon is life, constituting more than 50% of the dry weight of all living organisms. Soil that has been depleted by mismanagement loses the life in it, and therefore has less carbon in it, letting more escape to the atmosphere. Healthy topsoil, on the other hand, is a carbon-rich ecosystem in itself, full of tiny carbon-based life forms that feed on each other, and on the sweet, sugary exudates that plant roots give off. Up to 40% of the sugars that plants make go into the soil to feed microscopic fungi and bacteria. In return, these soil microorganisms provide the plants with the soil structures and nutrients they need to grow deep, healthy roots and keep the whole process moving downward and upward, feeding animals and people as well. So, can we use photosynthesis and soil microbiology to help turn atmospheric carbon back into living and stored carbon on Earth? Yes, we can, and people are already doing it. Certain farmers and ranchers have been experimenting with ways to improve soil carbon formation on the land they're stewarding, so much so that they've been referred to as carbon cowboys and carbon farmers. Returning to the bathtub metaphor, in order to stop the overflow of carbon in the great bathtub in the sky, we need to unplug the drain. And that will involve restoring ecosystems so that plants, trees, and soil organisms can use the power of photosynthesis to take atmospheric CO2 and put that carbon back into creative use, rebuilding the underground structures that we all depend on for health and resilience, rather than storing it in a vault somewhere as if it was radioactive waste. I called Bob up and told him what I'd learned. Huh, he said, sounding vaguely interested. But I still want to invent a machine that will do the same thing. That would be really cool. So, I like to just take a little break and have people turn to someone next to them and just share any thoughts that come up. And then we can move into a discussion, and if people want to keep reading little parts, you can do that too. But So you guys can turn to you guys.
Definitely.
I'll jump in. So, any questions or comments or thoughts? I know Deb, you had something you were
Oh,
wanting to share.
I just shared it with my neighbor here, but I'll tell everybody about it. And that is, my mother is 89 and she has Parkinson's. She was diagnosed about 10 years ago. And last summer, she almost died. My sister and I and her caretakers figured that she wasn't going to be with us much longer. And she was taking about 8 different medications. And I went with her to her primary care physician, and she wasn't saying anything. She was just sitting there folding her hands, and she wasn't saying much of anything. And I just like, at the end I said, don't you know why she fell? Because she fell asleep. She just like falls asleep all the time, and she wakes up with these horrible nightmares, and she's disoriented and everything. And, you know, whew, this is terrible. And he hadn't read the nurse's notes, apparently. I assume they write notes. And he said, oh, okay. And he typed in those side effects. He put it in like the last drugs that she'd started taking from her neurologist. And the first 2 things, night terrors and falling asleep at strange times. And he's okay, well, maybe I'll call up her neurologist and ask him if, you know, we can adjust the dosage. And so they halved it twice. And then maybe it's eliminated now. And then she was having other side effects that weren't quite as bad, but really still disabling. And so gradually they worked down, she's just down to 2, and she is very energetic now, and she's doing really well.
Yeah.
That's
It
great.
really,
That's great.
yeah,
And those drugs were very expensive.
yeah.
They do not pay, you know, the insurance doesn't pay for them, and
And they were hurting rather than
a hardship,
helping.
and yeah, and it was hurting her, it was killing her.
Oh, that's scary.
And I think the doctors had good intentions, I really do, but just that whole pressure, because, you know, they hear about, you know, and that's why I figured my mother wasn't saying anything, because every time she complained about something, they'd say, oh, well, to give you this drug, or that drug. Yeah, so she was just sitting there, I don't want any more drugs.
It's just too easy for them to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
Just
Yeah,
take
well,
pills and
they're
call
trying to
it.
help you, you want help.
Yeah, that's what they're expected to do, I guess, and that's what they do.
I think
Yeah,
that the younger generations though are questioning their physicians more, whereas older folks are used to listening to whatever the doctor said and thinking they know what they're talking about. But I know I and people younger than me tend to question and look up the side effects on the internet and say, I don't think I want that.
Yeah.
I'll risk the other problems as opposed to taking that drug. Yeah. I know what you went through though, because my dad had Parkinson's later, and we had to say, we don't want him on all this stuff. You've got to reduce it to the least amount, or, and then, you know, because he was falling asleep, drop of a hat.
Hmm. What was the name of that drug there? I can't remember it, but it was terrible.
One of the sections toward the end in here, I talk about the commons of care, getting back to the idea of the commons. And I give some various examples of the social commons of care, where things that people have figured out, including in the Upper Valley, there's been a lot of towns that now have a town nurse whose job it is to help coordinate care and talk to people about their medications and stop in, and they're just on a salary, usually from either the church or from the town, and so people don't have to think about insurance or is it covered or not. And it's a beautiful
That's wonderful.
program. Dennis McCullough, who is a Norwich resident, was one of the people who started that.
That's right.
Interesting, Norwich doesn't have a town nurse though.
I think they did for a while,
Did
but
they?
yeah, but I'm not sure
I've
what
never
happened.
heard of it.
Well, they may, actually, they may still, yeah. It's not usually terribly well advertised. It's often
I know
through it.
Thetford has one.
Thetford just got one, yeah. Yeah.
Hensley.
Joyce
You
Inslee
know-
does it. Joyce Inslee does it, and she's
In Lyme?
amazing.
No.
Lyme in Hanover, in Hanover.
Hanover, yeah.
She's amazing. She'll go to homes and visit people and then come back the next day and check on them. It's amazing.
How can one person take care of so many people?
Well, it's, they have ways of figuring it out
they
so
do.
that, they're not taking care of people, they're really just coordinating care. So
Yeah.
there's often a lot of people who want to volunteer or give people rides or go check on them or
That's right.
make sure they took their medication, but they don't feel like they can intrude. Like they don't know who in town necessarily needs help, or they feel like they'd be overstepping their boundary to do that. I think that's particularly hard in New England, you know, we're very private people in many ways. So, so the town nurse sort of gets to be a little bit nosy and figure all that stuff out and then say, would you mind if Deb stopped in next Thursday to just see how you're doing? Or, you know, like, so it's a particular role, and then they might do a blood pressure clinic every now and then or something, you know. But they're not doing direct patient care. It's different than the visiting nurse, but.
But they might have a space where they're, give their time there, and if you have a question, instead, you just go, you know, I have this thing, and look what
Exactly,
it's doing. And then they
exactly.
tell you, would go to the doctor,
Exactly.
or take
So a lot
this,
of
or don't
triage,
take that,
yeah.
or what medicine. There's sort of an in-between,
Yeah.
which is marvelous, because it is a nice in-between.
Yeah, exactly.
So where do you find out if your town has it?
I would call the town office,
Yeah.
or if you're a town that only has one or two churches, the churches often know also. So. And sometimes they're the ones sponsoring. So.
If we do have a town nurse, I hope that we can get her or him to come to the library and talk more about what they're doing,
Yes.
because I'd actually
Yeah.
not heard of this concept before, and
Yeah,
probably not the only one, but it seems like something people should know about.
yeah. Other thoughts or things that came up while we were reading earlier?
Well, I haven't, of course, read your book, so I'm wondering how in the world there can be a shift in the world, because there's so many people who have all the information and refuse to put it into practice for their own health or whatever. I have a lot of friends like that, you know. Working in the campground, we have recycling stations, and I'm amazed at the amount of individual plastic bottles that are brought in, and I'm like, it'd be so much simpler to buy like a big jug or several jugs and refill a washable bottle, you know, but people don't do that, so, you know, that's a big issue.
So, I'd love to hear your take on this, but that reminds me of this concept called nudge, where there are ways that institutional designers and policymakers can create policies that sort of nudge people towards one thing or the other. So for example, and I think it was France, there was a very, very low rate of organ donation, because it is like it is in several states in the US where you can mark on your driver's license if you want to be an organ donor, or on your national ID. I'm not sure what card it was, but it was an opt-in system, and there was very, very low participation. And obviously not all changes are going to be that easy, but once it was changed to an opt-out system where the default was you are an organ donor and you have to, you know, then it almost completely reversed, where it was 90% were organ donors and 10% were not. So if there's some way that people who are, you know, designing policies and institutions can sort of design things to just, because maybe sometimes people just do what's easier or more convenient.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with what's available. You know,
Right.
one of the other
Yeah.
examples in the book is about this movement in hospitals that are starting to provide local and organic foods for their patients and in their cafeterias. And it's actually started here in Vermont. is one of the pioneering places that's doing that. And there are now thousands of hospitals that are doing that initiative. And so I feel like there's actually a lot more going on than we think, and that
But
there
you
is
know, those cases of bottles go out all the
Yeah.
time, and
Yeah.
the water's good at the park, it's city water.
yeah.
I have an idea about that. At Dartmouth, maybe at other schools too, they had this thing for a week, the students could carry around a clear garbage bag, and they had to put in all their, anything they would have chucked in the garbage. They carried around to classes.
Carried with them for a whole
That's a good
Yeah,
idea.
for a whole week. If they could, could you think you could fit everything in?
I think that's a good idea.
That's good. Maybe they could hand them out at the beginning, people walking around the park and saying,
Yeah.
Be glad to see the end of that week.
But everyth's so easily accessible because of our system of consuming
yeah.
and shopping and throwing.
And I mean, having traveled to Cuba where capitalism sort of collapsed or got, and also something else replaced it, and then even their system of socialism then collapsed when the Soviet Union collapsed. So, and they became very, very innovative and very, I mean, not all places do that. Some places just start fighting, but Cuba was in good shape for a variety of reasons to start figuring things out. And lots of reuse, lots of really creative things. So maybe we will learn something from them now that we're starting to open those borders a little bit, but.
Well, they had to keep their cars going. They weren't gonna
Yeah, so
get
the
any
cars
other
there are
so
all
they
from the
wouldn't-
1950s,
Yeah,
so everybody learned how to be a mechanic. if
They
already
became
know.
very innovative quickly, so they
Exactly.
just moved into other things, which is
Yeah.
a good idea.
So I guess the answer is I feel like there's a way in which we're getting to a point where a lot of people are already having a hard time and needing to be more resilient, and that it may be that we just need to go a little further, into
Well,
the.
that's true, and I'm trying not to be pessimistic, but so much of what we have today, refrigerators, washers, dryers, televisions, computers are all designed to self-destruct in 5
Yes.
years or
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if they're not physically designed to do that, then now we are kind of designed to get sick of things. Or
Right.
think, oh,
Well,
no,
on the other side,
I'm
yeah.
tired of this. There's something wrong with this blouse, but oh, I'm tired of this. I need a new blouse. Or oh, my computer's so slow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's more typically American than European. The Europeans have a more regard for things that are older and more, I think the Americans, it's a disposable system we've set up for ourselves, so somehow we have to kind of back that off and try and, create a system that's more economically feasible to keep us breathing, keep the planet breathing.
How many people bring their own market bags to the market rather than using the plastic ones?
It's starting to switch.
Those
a little
things you
bit.
can't even get rid of.
Well, I think a
You
lot
can
of
at
people
Price
bring them.
Chopper.
Pardon?
Price Chopper, you can recycle plastic bags and plastic
And
wrap.
in Thetford Recycling. you
Yeah,
can-
but they, I don't know what they do with them when they get them back.
I hope they make them into
Isn't-
something that's somewhat useful.
Isn't it Walmart or someplace that took the recycled bags and had somebody make them into things that they resold? Oh, I think it was Walmart.
I think a lot of the bottles that you have, the plastic bottles, they make outdoor seats with them
That's, yeah.
and furniture. That's one thing they can do. I don't know what they can do with the plastic bags.
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that they've been, of course, then that uses more carbon to recycle them, but.
In India, they're taking the bottles and then stuffing the plastic bags into them and packing them really tightly and using them as bricks, and they're building houses.
No kidding.
What's that?
Wow, say that again.
Well, that's good. There's
So they
less
take a
pressure.
plastic soda bottle, and then they have people, so, kids come over on certain days and they stuff as many of the plastic bags.
You can get more than 100. That's
There's
what
what
Spiro
Spiro
said.
said,
Yeah.
more than 100 you can get in a
100
soda
bags
bottle.
in a
Is that
soda
right?
bottle?
And
In
you
a
cap it-
12-ounce bottle?
You cap it back up, and then they're using them, they
build a
they
house.
build walls, and they use stucco or mud or something
To
around
tie it
them.
together.
And
Yeah.
and they're very, very solid indestructible
I
buildings.
saw a glass bottle house in
Mhm.
Arizona.
Mhm.
Really?
They collected
Yeah, they're
bottles.
quite pretty, actually.
Glass
Yeah.
bottle house, wow.
Yeah, there's one in, I think it's PEI too.
Where?
Prince Edward Island.
Oh,
There's one
It's
in
not a
British
whole house.
Columbia made out of square glass bottles that are the old embalming fluid.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it was built by the mortician.
It is spare time.
It's a tourist place now, but I went there as a kid a couple of times because you pass through the area through the Rockies, and I was fascinated by it. So it's a real treasure.
People are very innovative and resilient if you give them half a chance and you make it fun. I think that's one of the answers, is that you have to find a way to make it fun and creative.
I wanted to ask you a question when you were talking about carbon and the plants bringing it down out of the big bathtub in the sky. I wanted to ask you about lawns versus fields.
Yeah, good question. So, you mean like letting the lawn grow up into more of a meadow? Mhm. So, there isn't a simple answer to that, but I mean, we do know that lawnmowers are, use up a lot of gas because of the way the motor cycle, the cycling of it. It's different than a car. So, so that's one thing. So if you do have a lawn, then using a push mower or borrowing a sheep or a goat to mow it is a good thing, or a scythe. And the field can be one of the most useful ways of doing that process of photosynthesis where you're feeding the microbes. But typically, in the way nature would do it, would be to have a herd of animals come through and graze it and then leave. So we either need to find a way to reproduce that, or actually literally, ask someone if they want to graze their sheep there. So using it as a hay field where you're exporting that carbon to somewhere else is going to, over time, wear down the soil there. So what you would typically do would be either to just graze it down once or twice a year, or to cut it and then let animals come eat the hay there. So I just came back from North Dakota, and there was a farmer there who noticed that during a drought, the field where he was haying to get hay for the animals to give them in the barn in the winter wasn't producing much at all, and the soil was really getting bad, and the grass wasn't growing well, and it was starting to sort of desertify. And the field where he grazed the cattle in the field was doing fine, even though there was a drought. Like the soil had more moisture in it. And so...
It's also being fertilized.
And it's also being, so that's a big piece of it, is the microbiome of the soil that I talk about here. And I also talk about the microbiome of the gut that you were reading. And so he thought, well, what if I just make a stack, because North Dakota is cold in the winter, so and very windy, so he would cut the hay and bale it, but he'd make a windbreak in various places in the pasture. And then every day or every week, he'd take one of the bales and just roll it out somewhere and let them eat it there in the winter, but they could always go to that shelter nearby. And you wouldn't believe the color of the grass there. I mean, it was just the most beautiful green, even right after he cut it. And meanwhile, his neighbors' fields looked terrible because they've had a lot of drought there. And now he's thinking about not even bothering to cut it, but just letting them graze, building some sort of a windbreak and letting them just graze right through the snow, which they will do. Buffalo are really what we should be grazing there on the prairies, because they're designed to graze through snow. That's their whole anatomy, and also to the wind. They just put their head right up and just stand in it, whereas cows will kind of huddle together and will sometimes get down. They really need a shelter, whereas buffalo don't. Yeah, buffalo don't need that. So I forgot your first name.
Deb.
So Deb, Do you mind if I share that, or you share it? Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Go ahead, just.
I raised my kids on a farm, a wheat farm in northwestern North Dakota, and now my middle child is married to a gentleman, and they have cattle, and they're doing the whole grass-fed beef. He does hay, but he doesn't, plow anything up or anything like that. So what she's talking about is how they do it, and they move the cattle. He uses electric fences, and the cattle are moved every couple of weeks to a different section of the land.
As if they were a wild herd. So when you do this kind of holistic management, you take the cattle and you move them in a pretty close bunch, and you don't bring them back until the grass has had a chance to regenerate. And it could be sheep or goats or whatever, and or even chickens and turkeys. You don't have to eat the animals. There's some people who are like, we shouldn't be eating animals. Well, that's okay. But grasslands evolved with grazing animals. So you can't actually till a prairie soil and have it remain a prairie soil. It won't stay a prairie soil. It will turn into dust, which we saw in the Dust Bowl.
And another thing that they do that's different than most of what you buy is they do not finish off, and this is how we raised our beef. We finished them off with special feed, put a little fat into them and stuff like that. And they don't do that. They don't give them corn, or they don't do any of those things to make them fat or anything. So when they butcher, the cattle, the meat has to hang for about 3 weeks as opposed to 10 days when
Really?
they're, and that tenderizes it.
And there are now people figuring out certain grass mixes, and you were saying that they're also starting to plant special forage
Yeah,
for them that will actually help to fatten them up without the grain, but that's just like things that have naturally more sugars in them. So people are figuring out a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, it's really.
Yeah, I've seen the transformation of the fields also, because where I grew up in Northfield, actually, Vermont, there was kind of a gentleman's farm. My father wasn't a full-time farmer, but some people bought it, and they rotate animals through. They don't have cows, but they have sheep, goats, turkeys, chickens, and pigs. And they rotate them through in a certain way. And the fields which had like moss and that, I forget that.
Lichen?
Yeah, there's some different, I can't remember the name of that flower, but it's a wild flower, and kind of a weedy looking flower actually. And the ground became got very lush green grass.
Yeah.
It's a real transformation.
Yeah.
And there was very little hay at all when they started farming it there.
Yeah, in North Dakota, you still need hay because cattle really can't forage very well in the winter up there. It just doesn't enough calories. So you still have to have hay. But I had an idea. We have town nurses. Maybe you could have town goats.
They are doing that. So I have a friend in the Boston area who has 3 or 4 goats, and she goes to public parks for 2 or 3 hours a day and grazes the goats. One of them is on a leash, and the other 2 have been trained to follow.
Oh,
On
fun.
a leash, long leash. So she just sits and reads a book. And
I'm thinking about people with these huge yards, like acres
right.
of yards.
No, that's happening. There are people who come in with sheep or goats. Yeah, and of course goats are very good they're good at eating your flowers, but they're also good at grazing things that other animals typically won't.
Right.
So when you're trying to clear brush and things, goats are very useful.
So there's an alternative way to make money for people that
Yes.
are more creative and like animals.
What I'd like to see are
Instead of
grazing corridors. You know how we have wildlife corridors?
Yeah.
Actual grazing corridors where we take down some of the fences in these areas, and where you could literally get community, several farms worth of animals to move together, which is what they did in Africa to restore the land there. Incredible, literally from desert to lush grassland and even wetland in the same piece of land that shifted. So I really recommend, if you haven't seen it, watching Alan Savory's TED Talk he's one of the people who pioneered some of this restoration work using grazing animals. So,
Is that on the computer?
Alan Sa- yeah, it's a TED Talk, which are you know, have you heard? seen the
NPR
TED Talk?
has them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and his name is Alan Savory. He's a wildlife biologist in Africa.
And how do deer come into grazing? I mean,
So around here, that's-
in
yeah.
my field behind my
Yeah.
house, I see the deer out there grazing a lot, but you never see, they don't eat the field down at all.
Right, right,
You know.
yeah. I mean, New England is not as brittle of an environment, so it's a little more forgiving of what we're doing. And you know, deer in general, I mean, we don't like them when they get in our flower beds, but I think they're generally, you know, a beneficial in terms of that kind of, in terms of a meadow, that's, yeah.
So, but when I asked the question, it was because where I live in a condominium, and we had 2 meadows, and some people said, oh, let's mow this meadow every week and make it a big lawn.
Yeah,
And to me, this just didn't seem like a very good idea, so I'm just trying to get as much science about it as I can. Because it still doesn't seem a very good idea to me.
But if you don't have animals to go through the meadow, what, I mean, how is it gonna?
yes, you can't, I mean, it will, in New England, it will turn into a forest if you don't do it. And in the Midwest, it will actually turn into a desert. Because the grass will shade, the dead grass won't decompose, there's not enough moisture, especially like in the Southwest. And it will shade out, the other grasses and then it'll dry and then it'll either be a fire or or it will just, just won't grow. And you end
So
up with
if-
bare soil.
If you mow a meadow once a week, well, not once a week, but once a year,
Mhm.
and you leave the grass there, how is that working with carbon retention in the
So that's,
soil?
I mean, that's not a bad way to do it, you know, it depends how much material there is and et cetera, so of the dead plant material. You want to make sure that it's not so heavy and thick that it's killing off what's under there. But in general, that will keep it as a meadow. And that carbon of the grass will be eaten by the decomposers and keep feeding.
So the carbon will stay in the earth that way, but if you're mowing it every week, you're releasing carbon every week, aren't you?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot that we don't know. So the organization that I work for now is called the Soil Carbon Coalition, and we're monitoring at farms and ranches and lawns and things all across North America. So I've been to Alberta and just came back from North Dakota. And we're just learning what things do what. So we have some ideas, but just to give you a picture in terms of numbers, that the best progress we've seen in terms of over time is that there are about 5 or 6, actually I think it's 7 different farms in Saskatchewan who are using this holistic planned grazing like your children are. And the best one of those, on every square mile of land that's being managed that way, every year they are drawing down the equivalent of 800 people's CO2 emissions into the land. That's how fast it's gaining carbon by their managing it as if it was managing their cattle as if they were a wild herd. So when you hear people say, oh, cows are contributing to climate change, it really depends on how they're managed. So, and even if you were to take the methane into account, it's a total net gain in terms of carbon in the soil and out of the atmosphere. So France did some calculating and figured out that if all of the agricultural land gained 4 parts per 1,000 of carbon per year, or actually I don't know if it's per year, but you can look it up. It's called the 4 per mille, the 4 per 1,000 initiative, that it would reduce our atmospheric carbon back to 350 parts per million. So, because about 1/3 of our current emissions are from mismanaged land, And soil is a huge sink for carbon. I mean, traditionally it was, and about half of the carbon that we used to have in the soil has already been released to the atmosphere. So that's very, very easy to put back in. Plants know how to do that. But most parts of the country are doing long periods of bare fallow where they're they're tilling the field and then leaving it bare, so there's no photosynthesis happening. So if you look at Google Earth in June and you go down in Kansas or Nebraska or any of those big agricultural states, it's brown, it's not green on the solstice, on the summer solstice. So our longest sunlight days, there's very little photosynthesis happening. So that's the key, is to keep living roots in the ground year round as much as possible. So anyway, we'll wrap it up because I don't want to keep people out too late. It's a school night. But except that school hasn't started, but we're still in school month. What I'm doing now, I've been running a clinic in Thetford Center for over 22 years. And I still see some patients, but mostly what I'm doing now is writing curriculum and creating learning resources for schools and communities on the tie-in between the microbiome of the body and the microbiome of the soil, and on the carbon cycle that students study, but how that ties in to soil and water and climate change and flooding and all of that.
So you're passing that, it's not just for adults, but it's being taught in the schools?
Yes, so there are 350 schools in Oklahoma that just asked for this curriculum. And we've been doing it at schools in the Upper Valley, Hartford High School and Mascoma and
What about this?
Rivendell.
What about urban areas or?
So I did a week-long residency in Chicago last May. That was wonderful. That went really well. They met and figured out a holistic management plan for restoring their schoolyard, which was turning to sand. So it's like, why not just do it?
project.
I used to live in Chicago.
Oh, you did?
And what I love about Chicago is they have those wonderful forest preserves that run all the way from Wisconsin down way south. And there's at least 3 strips of them all the way.
I didn't hear about that while I was there.
Oh, you
Yeah.
need to check it out.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I really enjoyed going there. That was a good.
I saw more wildlife in yards and
Wow.
places in Chicago than I ever did
Wow.
living on the farm.
Really? Wow. Yeah. So,
I remember I went to school in Germany, it was a long time ago, and it was a small city, and you just walked down the sidewalk and never saw any lawn at all. Every little teeny square foot was flowers or vegetables. People gardened. There's- Like the sidewalks would be covered with rose petals.
Wow.
Trash. It was very nice. And even back then, that was in the 70s, late 70s. They had, you had to bring your own bag to the grocery store. And if you didn't bring it, they gave you this like, what an idiot. How are you going to carry all this stuff? And then he's like, can you give me a bag? And
if they just stopped offering bags at grocery stores, people would figure it out pretty quick.
They would have to go look, you know?
Yeah.
The Woodstock Farmers Market, which is on Route 4, started you can't get it, they won't give you any bags. They have bags you can borrow, if you bring them, you take them back, but you have to bring all your own bags.
Are you talking about the grocery?
No, I'm talking about the Woodstock
Open.
Farmers Market up the road heading towards on Route 4.
You mean like where farmers actually come to sell food?
No, it's,
Or you mean
it's a
the
store?
It is a store.
Yeah.
okay.
Well, they'll sell you a paper bag for 10 cents.
Oh, they might say.
Because I went in and my bags were in the car and she says, well, for 10 cents you can buy a bag.
But they're really encouraging you to
Yeah.
bring your own bag or share bags or, yeah.
Yeah.
Even if you pick up your vegetables, they don't carry any of those plastic bags to put your vegetables in to get
Oh.
them. No, that's done.
Which is good.
Yeah, it's very good, yeah. I use those all too frequently, I have to curb that, but, yeah.
I'm curious if you find ways of incorporating some of the Chinese theory, Chinese medicine
I
theory
do.
of the 5 elements into the curriculums.
Yeah, I think the one place where that shows up pretty strongly in the book is that I talk about how in Chinese medicine, the respiratory system and the digestive system and the skin are all part of the metal element, and that's where we think of Wei Qi, which is like the protective Qi, or the immune system would be another way of putting it, all works. And those are some of the primary areas where the microbiome is active. So the skin, our nose, our throat, and our digestive tract. And interestingly, in Chinese medicine, they talk about which flavors nourish which systems. And when I went to school, we thought it was very strange that they talked about this rotten flavor that nourished the lungs, you know, or nourished the lung and large intestine. And we'd have these discussions about what is it rot, like what food is there that tastes like, the other ones are easy, it's like salty or sweet or sour, we knew what those were. And then later, after I finished school, I started learning about lacto-fermented foods, or what is sometimes called the umami flavor, you know? And that those are what restore all of the probiotics. So true sauerkraut and kombucha and yogurt and kefir, and that those are all foods that have rotted, right? I mean, that's the lacto-fermentation process. And so I just love that, like 2,500 years ago, they were already figuring these things out. And I don't know, I don't talk to that many other acupuncturists, so I don't know whether that's taught, whether when they say rotten flavor, they understand that now. I imagine that they do, but that's what I figured out. And then I talk about the soil as being like the mucosal membrane, or the Wei Qi of the land. So it's where the respiration and the digestion and the immunity and the reproduction, which is the other sort of mucosal membrane area where we have a strong microbiome. That's where those things happen on the earth. And it is literally, so soil parent material is just broken down rocks. It's just sand, silt, and clay. That's typically how it's described in agricultural schools or with farmers. But what really makes soil is the microbial activity and the plant exudates, which some people call the snots, slimes, and glues of life, which every living thing produces, right? Even bacteria. And that those stick together, those little particles, and it turns it from something that's like flour into something that's like bread. So if you think about how you turn flour into bread, it's microbial action of the yeast, right? And that creates pore space where the water can soak down through and where roots can go down easily. So it gets rid of compaction. And that's how the water cycle works on Earth. If we don't have those snots, slimes, and glues creating that structure in the soil, then the water cycle is completely broken. It's like pouring water onto flour, where it runs off and it erodes, versus pouring flour onto bread, where you have this nice sponge that just soaks it in and keeps it there for plants, and it doesn't evaporate off so quickly. It doesn't create flooding.
It's water into bread, not flour into
What
bread.
did I say?
Flour into
It
bread.
turns flour into bread? Okay.
No, it's pouring flour.
Pouring flour.
Oh, what a great image. So pouring water, thank you, pouring water into bread. So when I'm in more teaching mode rather than book reading mode, I actually will bring plates of flour and bread. And we make little rain cups by poking toothpicks into things. And you can do this anywhere. So it's a great teaching about how does soil work. And
It's fascinating.
and it's a really easy visual as to why we need to restore this, what I call the soil carbon sponge across the whole earth. So if we do that, we fix the water cycle. The soil has more nutrients in it for growing plants. And what are those snots, slimes, and glues made out of? They're made out of carbon. So that is the soil carbon, is that structure that's being built. It's the living, the dead, and the very dead. becomes soil carbon. And ultimately, you know, if we wait another few million years, that becomes something more like petroleum. But in our lifetimes, it will create a beautiful, fertile sponge that will keep our landscapes both dry in areas that are prone to flooding. So like if Irene came through, the water would sink more in, and keeps it moist in places where water would evaporate quickly or run off. So it regulates temperature. Also, we think about walking on asphalt versus walking on
Right.
a spongy soil. It regulates the temperature around, because of course that temperature radiates out, and it draws down atmospheric carbon. So we think we have all these different problems. We think we have problems with economics and with food security and with water shortages and with soil and desertification and conflicts over arable land and water, and anything you can think of basically goes back to those snot, slimes, and glues not sticking those particles together. So we really only have one problem, is that we've broken the carbon and water cycle, and we've forgotten about the beautiful power of photosynthesis and microbial activity to bring things back together again.
So we have to back up.
So yeah, we just go back to what we learned in 4th grade, you know? And the funny thing is, schools teach this very early on, and then they drop the subject and never bring it back up again. So my goal now is to bring that back around into high school and college and community level, you know, so for adults and older,
That's great.
older young people, so.
Great.
And it's actually really simple. So all these things that we're struggling with are really very solvable. And often in just a matter of a few years, you can take a broken landscape and fix it.
So I lived in New Mexico for a while, and it's all rocks because there's very little vegetation. There's not much water to break, to break the rocks down. There's not very little vegetation to break them down, and all the water just runs off terribly. And all I wanted to do was compost, but I just wondered how, can you really fix it by?
There's an incredible conference that happens in November in New Mexico every year called the Quivira Coalition, Quivira, and it is there's like 300 or 400 people who go to the conference, and they're not all from the Southwest, but many of them are ranchers and farmers living in the Southwest who are figuring out ways to do this in that landscape. Alan Savory, whose TED Talk I recommended, lives in New Mexico precisely because he's working on restoring land in that area. So he moved from Africa to New Mexico. He spends time in both places. But it is happening in landscapes that are that barren. So there are some places that are true desert where really there was nothing, nothing ever really did catch hold there. It's not
Until irrigation.
But right,
In Arizona.
but there's not that. Most of the places that we think of as desert, like the Middle East, not the Sahara, but the rest of the Middle East, we think of as sort of a desert-like landscape. Well, that was called the Fertile Crescent, right? And there's a really interesting book called Dirt: The Erosion of Civilizations by David Montgomery, and he talks about how tilling the soil, any culture that figured out to till the soil to grow plants, after about 1,000 years, the civilization fell, and it's because that's about how long it takes to completely use up all of the microorganisms and plant fertility that would be there in the soil if you were leaving it to its own devices. So the United States is getting close. The colonists weren't the first people to do that. There was tillage already happening to a certain degree, but we really speeded it up. So we were actually a little bit ahead of the clock, but we've lost a huge amount of topsoil in the United States. We think of desertification as being, that happens other places, but it's definitely happening here. And it's also being reversed here. So the good news is that if you talk to a geologist or even most soil scientists, they say it takes 10,000 years or 1 million years to create an inch of topsoil. They're talking about the parent rock material. It takes 2 or 3 years to do that. with holistic management or with regenerative agriculture. So as long as you haven't had it all washed down into the ocean, which is a problem.
But where it's all rocks, you can still,
Well, I mean, not on the top of a mountain. I mean, if it's literally just a rock, but if you
No.
have, but if there is
Some soil.
sandy soil and rocks, yes, you can. Yes, you can. I mean, it may take a little irrigation to kickstart it, or import some compost or something, but anywhere where there was like grazing herds in the past can be brought back to that, as long as there's enough of the parent material left. So,
Have you heard of the Boyce Thompson Arboretum east of Phoenix,
no.
east of Apache Junction? Boyce Thompson, it's a wonderful place to visit if you ever go down to the Phoenix area. Boyce Thompson wanted to find all the types of plants that could survive in arid or semi-arid that would nurture people.
Oh.
And so this arboretum has different areas. So it's got the desert culture and it's got an African, but plants were brought in from all over the world that he did on his own, and it's now become a state park.
Wow. And going back to that question, this sort of reminds me what you're saying, that one theory about how soil even developed in the first place, or how it regenerates after like a volcanic eruption. So they've done studies where they see that the first thing that usually will populate a fresh lava flow that's cooled, are spiders, because they travel in, and they'll make a web.
Spiders.
So the spider will land, will make a web. That web starts catching bugs and little leaves and other things from the breeze and bits of dust, etc. And that and of course there are microbes in there, right? And though that life will decompose with some bacteria that are there, that sets up like a tiny thin layer of sort of like a little bit the beginnings of what might be soil. But once you have anything like that happening, the microorganisms break down the rocks in order to provide nutrition to what's growing there. So you can take literally a bare rock and grow something on there if you have the sort of the weather conditions and a little water and a little
Spiders.
and spiders. Yes, and spiders. I think they're around for a while.
that's interesting.
So and from there you can build many feet of soil over time. I mean, life is very, very persistent. So, yeah.
Wonderful, yeah, hopeful message. Sometimes we read about these kinds of issues and we do feel like, oh, there are too many problems and they're so complicated, and it's nice to to hear that there are solutions and there are even simple solutions. Yeah, so it's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your work with us. And